Thank you so much, Dennis, for that very kind introduction. Thank you for pitching the book, which I will just mention to all of you with the holiday season coming, makes a lovely gift for friends and family. Widely available at fine booksellers, including Amazon. Done. Okay. What a joy to be with you today. It is such an honor for me to participate in this new Colloquium series and to share with you a personal passion, mania, whatever you want to call it, which has become, over the past 20 years or so, a focus of my academic work, which is increasingly my hobby since I have to spend so much time on my administrative duties as a historian of modern Japan. Now, I really want to give a huge shout out to the members of the OUAZ faculty who took the initiative to create this Colloquium series, which I think is a terrific idea and which I wish other campuses of OU would emulate. And we do have a faculty member here today from the Ottawa campus, so maybe she should take this seed back with her and let them know. So I really want to give a shout out to Professor Mahesh Ranpati Dewage. Trying so hard. I've tried so hard. I think you were the one who really came up with the idea in the beginning and then motivated others to join in. To Jack McMorris, Sam Potter, Usman, where are you, Usman? Usman, Anjum, and to Patricia Marsh, who has done so much for promoting research, especially among students here at OUAZ. Can we have a round of applause for them? And huge thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. And I'm going to start with a quiz. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. How many of you have seen a Godzilla movie? Awesome. This is a cultured group. Okay, I have something to work with here. How many of you have seen the original movie, which was called Godzilla, from 1954? Okay, good. So there is still some education to be done, but y'all are fantastic. And then how many of you have seen, or how many of you consider yourselves to be Godzilla fans? Any Godzilla fans in the room? That is great. I love that too. I'll tell you, it's a little bit different from the audiences I usually talk to, which are 100% Godzilla fans. So let's see if I convince you by the end of the talk that you should go out and watch some more Godzilla movies. Well, I first encountered Godzilla when I was 7 or 8 years old. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a Saturday afternoon in Bryan, Texas, where I grew up. I was lying on my stomach on the blue shag carpeting in my parents' bedroom in front of our big old Zenith TV set with its fake wood grain case. It was tuned to channel 39 from Houston, and the Creature double feature was on. I remember Godzilla appearing on the screen, and I remember falling in love. I wanted to be Godzilla. Who doesn't want to be Godzilla? Godzilla was huge. Godzilla was powerful. I looked at the monster, I said, man, I want to drag my big scaly feet through Tokyo and watch chemical plants explode and knock down skyscrapers. So Godzilla was, and Godzilla is, a great kiddie fantasy. But Godzilla was more than that to me. As a chubby Japanese-American boy in a small central Texas town with a total of 2 Japanese-American families, Godzilla was more than just a third grader's Saturday afternoon power trip. Godzilla became an important source of my personal identity. My friends and classmates at school, needless to say, didn't know a whole lot about Japan other than Pearl Harbor. And if the conversation turned to Pearl Harbor, it usually meant I was going to get beat up at recess. Okay? So there were not positive images of Japan out there back then. Now, the one thing they did think was pretty cool about Japan was Godzilla movies. And so I really embraced Godzilla as something about Japan and my heritage that I could relate to and that I could be proud of. Now, I'm guessing that most of you don't think of Godzilla as an ethnic hero, but he was to me. And here's a photo of as close as I've come to actually becoming Godzilla. Halloween, 1972, pretty close to 50 years ago here, in a costume made by my mother and grandmother, just about to head off to the haunted house at Davy Crockett Elementary School. Well, why tell this story other than to wallow a little bit in some personal nostalgia? Well, because it shows nicely, I think, how Godzilla is more than just a series of laughably cheesy films featuring an actor in a rubber suit walking through toy cities. Sure, Godzilla is a global pop culture icon, star of 35 live-action films made in Japan and Hollywood, with 2 more on the way, arguably the oldest and longest-running film franchise in world history. And sure, Godzilla is fodder for The Simpsons and has become part of our language through the Zilla suffix. He's also the subject of more internet memes and New Yorker cartoons than anybody can count. So if we go back to 1985, the New York Times conducted a poll among Americans to name a famous Japanese person. And you just know this is not going to turn out well, right? You know? So here's what they responded. Number 1 choice, Emperor Hirohito, who reigned over Japan for a very long period, was the emperor during World War II. Oh, full credit to Americans. Well done. Number 2, Bruce Lee, Hong Kong martial arts star. So close! Okay. And then number 3, who's it going to be? It's Godzilla, right? So Godzilla is lighthearted and silly and fun and childish, but Godzilla can, as we'll discuss today, also be serious and meaningful, offering commentary on current events, revealing insights on Japan and its post-war history, and providing an imaginative outlet for some of our deepest and darkest fears. On a personal level, Godzilla can be a lifelong friend and an unlikely source of ethnic identity. And up there on the silver screen, Godzilla affords us a valuable perspective on the people and cultures that created the films, as well as a window into the obsessions, the weaknesses, and the deepest anxieties of all of us who watched and enjoyed the series over the decades. We can learn a lot, it turns out, from Godzilla, about Japan, about what scares us, and about ourselves. So let's spend our time together this afternoon reflecting on Godzilla. What is the deal with this overgrown radioactive lizard that seems to love nothing better than destroying Tokyo? How did this global icon emerge from the imaginary of post-war Japan? How has Godzilla been adapted, reimagined, and some would say mistreated by Hollywood over the decades? How has the Godzilla series addressed the anxieties of movie audiences in Japan and internationally since the 1950s, from the nuclear fear of the Cold War era to the environmental concerns of the 1960s and 1970s, to the economic worries at the turn of the millennium, to today's struggles with issues like climate change? And I'll finish off by talking about a question which I think about a lot. Why does the world love Godzilla? Why, for over 70 years now, have we laughed and cried at, admired and disparaged, and continued to be fascinated by this unlikely reptilian movie star from Japan? So let's go back then. Let's go to Godzilla's origins. So in 1952, the classic Hollywood film King Kong, which was originally made in 1933, was re-released around the world. And it proved to be a smash hit, including in Japan. So this got the moguls in Hollywood thinking about, well, maybe giant monster movies are popular right now. Maybe we should start making some more. So the next year, Warner Brothers made The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which also turned out to be a blockbuster. This is a great film. It's about a brontosaurus that is frozen in an Arctic glacier that gets melted by atomic bomb testing, that proceeds then to swim down to New York City, where it goes to Coney Island to reproduce, to lay its eggs. And in the end, it gets barbecued in Coney Island, and the world is saved. Now, Japanese film studios have never been shy about stealing a bright idea from Hollywood, especially if it has commercial potential. And so they began thinking, early 1950s, let's make a giant monster movie of our own. But Godzilla was created not just out of commercial interests, but was very much ripped from the headlines and influenced by superpower politics and atomic age fears. So in March of 1954, a Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon No. 5 strayed into the US nuclear bomb testing zone near Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. The crew was exposed to massive amounts of radiation in the Castle Bravo test, which was the largest H-bomb test of all time. The bomb turned out to be much more powerful than even its American designers had imagined. One crew member subsequently died of radiation poisoning, and some of the irradiated tuna on the ship made it into the market in Japan. So back in those days, America never took responsibility for any kind of nuclear tests. The Pentagon said, well, maybe the people on the boat suffered from food poisoning. They never formally apologized, though they did end up making some token restitution payments to the families of those affected. Now, needless to say, this was huge news in Japan. It was called the latest atomic bombing of Japan in the media, especially, of course, since the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were very fresh memories at that time, okay? So it was, of course, the atomic attacks on these two Japanese cities that brought World War II to an end in 1945. So Godzilla was thus very much born out of the atomic age, out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and reflected Japan's collective trauma, still raw in the 1950s, at those horrifying events, at defeat in World War II, and at being occupied after the war by the US military for 7 years. So the story goes that Godzilla was the brainchild of a producer at Toho Studios named Tanaka Tomoyuki. And, the story goes that Tanaka was flying back to Japan from Indonesia, where he made a big blockbuster film, and he looked out the window of the plane at the sweep of the South Pacific Ocean, and he thought about the success of King Kong and the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and he thought about the Lucky Dragon incident, and he had a light bulb moment. What if I make a movie, he said to himself, where a dinosaur that has survived since the Jurassic period is irradiated by American H-bomb testing, grows huge, and then proceeds to attack Tokyo. So he went back, he pitched his idea, it was picked up by the studio, and Tanaka began recruiting people to make his film. He intended the film from the beginning to be a serious film, okay? Not aimed at kids, aimed at adults with a political message, and made in a high-quality way. So he hired for special effects a guy named Tsuburaya Eiji. And Tsuburaya had done amazing propaganda film work during World War II. And he was particularly noted for a film he made of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that used little tiny miniature ships and airplanes to reproduce those scenes. And it was said that his techniques were so strong that when the American forces first captured that movie and looked at it, they thought they were looking at actual footage that had been taken over Hawaii. Okay? So he really was a talented craftsman in special effects for the time. For director, Tanaka hired a guy named Honda Ishiro. Honda went on to become a very famous Japanese filmmaker, but back in 1954, he had fought for the Japanese army in China during World War II. He briefly had been a prisoner of war, and when the war was over, when Japan surrendered, he came back to Japan through Hiroshima. And he saw with his own eyes the extent of the damage. And that instilled within him a sense of anti-nuclear activism and appreciation for pacifism, for peace. Okay? And so he brought that agenda to the making of the movie. The name Gojira, which was later rendered into English as Godzilla, was allegedly a nickname given to an overweight employee at Toho Studios. It was not a great nickname because it comes from two Japanese words, gorira and kujira, gorilla and whale, and this employee was said to sweat a lot, hence the whale, I think, and that's how we got Godzilla. Now, Toho Studios invested a lot in the film, 60 million yen, about 3 times what a Japanese studio spent on most pictures at the time. But honestly, compared to what Hollywood would have spent on their cheapest film, it was still pocket change. Gojira opened on November 3rd, 1954, and we still celebrate November 3rd every year as Godzilla Day. Happy Godzilla Day, belatedly, to everyone. Box office receipts were strong, and its popularity, as well as its export potential to America and around the world, were such that a whole Godzilla franchise was born. So that first film, Gojira, is a dark, thoughtful, and politically charged film. Made for adult audiences, as I said, simmering with a lot of criticism of the United States, repressed feelings of Japanese pride and nationalism, and anxiety over nuclear testing and the threat of nuclear war. It masterfully played upon the audience's fears of the mounting Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, and the lingering psychological and physical scars of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the firebombing of Japanese cities during World War II. 66 Japanese cities were firebombed during the war, including Tokyo, and essentially obliterated. Godzilla's deeply furrowed skin, for instance, you can see all the texture in his skin, is said to have been inspired by the keloid scars that affected the survivors of the atomic bombs in 1954. This was commonly what happened to those who were fortunate enough to survive. Many Japanese viewers at the time, after watching Gojira, left movie theaters in tears. The story of a giant radioactive monster destroying Japan's capital city and ultimately then is killed by a new Japanese weapon of mass destruction was both cathartic and therapeutic for a nation still struggling to make sense of its recent history and a world divided by superpower rivalries, where Japan was poor and vulnerable and caught in the middle between the US and the Russians. And I'll just play for you now the original Japanese trailer for Gojira to give you a flavor of the film, which, as I said, was dark and ominous and genuinely moving to Japanese audiences. This is in Japanese, so you probably won't understand any of it, but I think you'll get the sense of the look and feel of the film.
私は気まぐれに言ってるんではないよ。あのゴジラ 界中の学者は誰一人として見ていない日本だけに現れた貴重な研究費だ。しかし先生、だからといって巨大な怪物をあのままほっとくわけにはいきません。今でもゴジラを抹殺しようというのはバカだ。素人のあなた一人を海の中に放り込みますか。これがしかないからね。どんなことで再び使用する立場に追い込まれないと誰が代弁できる。もしもそれが恐ろしい目的に使用されたとしたら。青年科学者セリザーが秘めた恐るべき発明とは。兵器を装備し、続々と出動する陸海空の精鋭。ゴジラの恐怖から脱出する難民の群れ。
So part of this film's power was that it made visible, explicit, and unavoidable a topic and a profound sense of tension within Japanese society that many Japanese people still found difficult to discuss openly in the 1950s. So during that American military occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952, the US military actively censored discussion of the atomic bombs in the media and in film. Even after the occupiers pulled out then, the Japanese were hesitant to discuss the traumas of war, the atomic attacks, and defeat. So Gojira, as I think you can see in those clips, put the legacies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki front and center, bombarded audiences with images of Japanese cities in flames and people suffering, and challenged viewers to engage both with their painful memories and with their ongoing fears in a world of H-bomb testing and Cold War brinksmanship. In short, Gojira was surprisingly rich in meaning, especially for a sci-fi movie about a giant monster running loose. Gojira is truly a classic, a powerful anti-nuclear and pacifist statement, and if you haven't seen it yet, I hope you will watch it. It is widely available, including free on the internet. So after that marvelous 1954 original, however, the quality of the series declined quickly. The serious message of the first offering was quickly jettisoned for more crowd-pleasing fare, and the age of the target audience moved steadily downwards. By the 1970s, 8-year-olds were the main market for Godzilla films. The films really degenerated into big-time wrestling in rubber suits, and the scripts and special effects were remarkably cheesy, although at the same time quite appealingly humorous. Who couldn't laugh at the King of the Monsters flying on his tail, or teaching his son how to blow radioactive smoke rings, or playing volleyball using a huge boulder with a gargantuan mutant lobster? This change in tone in the movies was due not just to shifting audience demographics, not just to having more kids watching, but also due to changes in Japan over time. Japan in the 1950s was an impoverished, developing nation, still recovering from defeat economically and psychologically. By the 1960s, though, the Japanese economy was booming, and people were optimistically, increasingly wealthy, and not so interested in seeing their nation destroyed by Godzilla and the parade of other giant creatures devised by Toho to battle him. Monsters we all have come to know and love, like Mothra, King Ghidorah, Rodan, and many, many others. So the movies became more lighthearted, and Godzilla was repositioned as a defender of Japan, a heroic figure rather than a vengeful monster intent on destroying the country. Godzilla has continued to evolve, of course, over the decades, reflecting the ongoing transitions in post-war Japanese society, changing perceptions of where Japan stood in the world, the shifting makeup of Japan's movie-going audiences, and the development of the Japanese movie industry, which has suffered through some really, really tough times. Remarkably, despite the changes in the tone and market of the Godzilla films, not to mention the changes in the appearance of Godzilla, which has morphed over time, the franchise continued to engage regularly with the fears of audiences and the timely issues of the day, mostly ones of importance in Japan, but also many that resonated with global moviegoers. In the 1960s, the issues addressed included political corruption, which was long a big issue in Japan, and also the commercialization of Japanese society. As the Japanese grew richer, they also bought more stuff. And so the films took on this materialistic nature of Japanese society. In the 1970s, among the issues that the films took up were the pollution problem and environmental awareness. And if you have not yet seen the movie Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, you are missing something good. This is a crazy, psychedelic movie that almost makes no sense, and yet curiously is actually a pretty strong statement against pollution and for environmental responsibility. From the 1980s through 2004, a wide variety of issues were treated, sometimes superficially, sometimes more deeply. The nuclear issue returned. Here's Godzilla taking the core out of a nuclear reactor, as did environmental issues, the remilitarization of Japan and Japanese nationalism, memories of World War II, and interestingly enough, Japan's wealth and arrogance in the world. So Tanaka Tomoyuki, the producer of many of the films, once said, and I quote, "Japan is rich and people can buy whatever they want. But what is behind that wealth? Nothing very spiritual. Everyone's so concerned with the material, and then Godzilla comes and rips it all apart. I suspect that is good for us all to see." So Godzilla even became something of a conscience for a wealthy, increasingly self-satisfied Japan. Although many of the movies in the series were not terribly timely or topical at all, what is impressive is the way in which Godzilla's makers regularly tapped into issues of widespread concern in Japan and globally to keep Godzilla something more substantial than just a big vengeful monster or a big heroic monster. The Godzilla series was eventually put on hiatus by Toho in 2004, after the 50th anniversary film Godzilla Final Wars proved a critical and box office flop. But in 2016, Godzilla came back in Japan with the well-made and politically charged Shin Godzilla, which is filled with references to the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown that struck Japan in 2011, is generous with criticism of the United States and China and Russia, and is absolutely scathing in its assessment of Japan's political leadership and government incompetence in responding to pressing natural disasters. There are a lot of useless committee meetings depicted in this film. The latest Toho offering, Godzilla -1 from 2023, proved to be a critical darling. It won the first Oscar in the history of the franchise, and was a big box office success in the US and internationally. This is another one of those movies that you should really see if you have the opportunity, as it checks the boxes in so many regards. It has great special effects, a terrifying Godzilla, and perhaps most unusually, a compelling human story tying it all together and making you care about what happens. A reimagining of the origins of Godzilla, the movie, which is set immediately following the end of the war in Japan, when Japan is at its very lowest point, pivots on a variety of issues. The guilt of war survivors and the search for redemption, the crisis in Japanese masculinity after defeat, and the failures of the Japanese government both before and after World War II. Like Gojira in 1954 and Shin Godzilla in 2016, Godzilla -1 is a serious and polished picture, and it provides a lot for viewers, both in Japan and America, to think about. So Godzilla has almost as long a history in the United States as in Japan. So the film Godzilla, King of the Monsters opened in the United States in 1956. It was a cleverly re-edited version of the 1954 Japanese original, with the unfortunate addition of Raymond Burr as a voyeuristic American reporter who witnesses the destruction of Tokyo. And you sort of have to be my age to get Raymond Burr, right? You know, a lot of the cheesy reputation comes from putting this guy in the film. This version was considerably altered from the Japanese original. Some have called it censored or even whitewashed by its distributors in Hollywood, notably in that all references to World War II, all mention of the atomic bombs, and anything that could be considered even vaguely critical of the United States was removed for American audiences. The fact that Gojira had to be sanitized in coming to America shows just how sharp-edged, politically charged, and compelling the Japanese original really was. Distributors didn't think they could get away with having as much criticism of America as that Japanese film did. Without the anti-nuclear pacifist edge, Godzilla, King of the Monsters was made into a rather run-of-the-mill monster on the loose action film. And I'll show you the trailer for the American version of Godzilla, Godzilla, King of the Monsters. And so as you're watching this, think back to the Japanese one I showed a couple minutes ago, and think to yourself, how is it different? And this, other than being in English, right, that will help a little bit. But even without that, you'll see it's a very different presentation of the movie.
Godzilla, King of the Monsters, alive, surging up from the depths of the sea on a tidal wave of terror to wreak vengeance on mankind. Godzilla, King of the Monsters, it's alive, a gigantic beast, stalking the earth, crushing all before it in a psychotic cavalcade of electrifying horror, raging through the streets on a rampage of total destruction. Godzilla, King of the Monsters, incredible titan of terror, wiping out a city of 6 million in a holocaust of flame. Jet flames cannot destroy it. Bombs cannot kill it. All modern weapons fail. Is this the end of our civilization? Can the scientists of the world find a way to stop this creature? For the answer, see Godzilla, King of the Monsters. You may wish to deny it, but your eyes tell you it's true. A tale down the line. More fantastic than any ever written by Jules Verne. More terrifying than any ever shown on the screen. Awesome. Incredible. Unbelievable. A story beyond your wildest dreams. Dynamic violence. Savage action. Spectacular thrills. Godzilla, King of the Monsters. Fantastic beyond comprehension. Gripping beyond compare. Astounding beyond belief. The mightiest monster of them all. See Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
You think maybe they oversold it a little bit in there? It's like every superlative in the dictionary. So one of the things that's really significant to note is that the original Godzilla from 1954, the Japanese version, was not available outside Japan until 2004. So most American fans, myself included, grew up thinking that that was the original, that Raymond Burr was in the original Godzilla movie. So this heavy editing of the original Japanese film and extreme sensitivity to any content that would put America in a negative light would turn out to be an ongoing feature of Hollywood's treatment of Godzilla. Through the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s, most of the Japanese giant monster films distributed in the US were heavily edited for American audiences. Even fairly innocuous political commentary was stripped out, and the movies were dubbed in intentionally comic ways to make the films more humorous rather than scary or serious. These sensibilities continued even after Hollywood studios began licensing the rights from Toho and producing their own Godzilla films. So some of you may remember the 1998 TriStar production marketed under the classy slogan, "Size Does Matter." This movie, which has Godzilla coming to New York City to lay its eggs in Madison Square Garden, is a good enough special effects picture, but it has no heart, and it was not true to the spirit of the original Japanese creature. It has been widely panned by Godzilla fans, including myself, and perhaps not surprisingly, for a movie featuring an escapee from Jurassic Park and Ferris Bueller, was not a particularly thoughtful or memorable entry in the series. The latest Hollywood offerings, the suite of big-budget, glossy Godzilla films in the MonsterVerse franchise from Legendary Pictures, have proven a bit of a mixed bag, but have been a whole lot better than the TriStar effort. How many of you have seen one of the new Hollywood films over the last 10 years? Okay, good, I like it. These are good Hollywood movies. The first Legendary offering, Godzilla in 2014, was successful commercially and critically, channeling the best of the Japanese Godzilla series and the best of early 21st century Hollywood movie making. It had a message, it had a heroic Godzilla, and it spoke to timely issues. Specifically, it addressed the human ordeals of natural disasters like the San Francisco earthquake, Katrina, and the tsunami and nuclear meltdown in Japan. The film did not use a man in a rubber suit to play Godzilla. I'm a purist. I love that old style. And while I might also have preferred a slightly trimmer monster, especially since you no longer had to fit a guy inside the suit, it did have great special effects and the kind of pacing and drama that really Hollywood does so well in action pictures. That was a good start to the Legendary series. The second movie, Godzilla King of the Monsters from 2019, was less successful in most respects, notably in its ham-fisted and harebrained attempts to address the threat of climate change. The third film, the long-anticipated Godzilla vs. Kong in 2021, was an absolute pandemic classic. It ignored the coronavirus altogether, but it offered up some imaginative monster escapism. In the midst of quarantines and vaxxing debates, seeing a big ape womping on a big lizard, and then both of them womping on a big robot, was probably what the world really needed. The less said about last year's Godzilla x Kong, the better. This was one silly movie, with Godzilla doing a belly flop off of the Rock of Gibraltar and curling up in the Roman Colosseum like a dog taking a nap. So Godzilla remains radioactive through all of these Hollywood films, but if you were looking for thoughtful commentary on nuclear threats or the legacies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the TriStar or Legendary Pictures, you would be sorely disappointed. In Godzilla King of the Monsters, for instance, it is radiation that somehow miraculously and completely unscientifically reverses climate change, refreezes the glaciers, and regenerates Amazonian rainforests. Even more strikingly, though, both TriStar and Legendary crafted a new narrative for Godzilla's origins, absolving the United States and deflecting the blame for creating the monster away from the Cold War and, above all, away from American nuclear testing. So if anybody remembers the 1998 Matthew Broderick TriStar film, do you remember how the monster got started there? So in that movie, Godzilla began as an iguana living on an island in Polynesia. And then it was French nuclear testing that made it morph into a giant monster. And that's the reason why, if you watch that film, you have this completely odd French secret agent character played by Jean Reno running around everywhere there. Fast forward then to 2014 and the Legendary series. Legendary also wrote a new origin story for Godzilla. Remember the original origin story? Godzilla's the surviving dinosaur swimming around in the South Pacific. Bam, one day, American H-bomb mutated into a huge angry dinosaur, a huge angry monster. Okay? Legendary says this. In Legendary's imagination, the world is hollow. In addition to our Earth that we know on the outside of the planet, the inside of the planet is empty. It's a place called Hollow Earth. And Hollow Earth, it turns out, is just filled with monsters. The world is like a piñata with monsters inside. And in the 1950s, these monsters start popping out of the Earth's crust in the South Pacific. And Godzilla is the first of them. Well, the powers of the world at the time, particularly the United States, say, everyone will freak out if we tell them they're giant monsters coming out of the Earth's crust. So let's keep it a secret and let's try to control them. How are we going to control them? By dropping H-bombs on them. So in Legendary's world, all the nuclear testing is actually a sham. They weren't testing nuclear weapons. They were trying to control giant monsters like Godzilla that had appeared naturally. So this maybe even goes one step beyond TriStar, okay? That was stupid blaming the French. In this case, the Americans are not responsible for Godzilla at all. Godzilla is a natural occurrence. But instead, they're almost humanitarian in dropping H-bombs on him and making him into this huge radioactive creature. And that's a picture of one of the H-bombs dropped on Godzilla. Now, I've already been talking a long time, and I'm eager to hear your comments and questions. Let me finish by addressing what seems like it should be, but I don't think is, a simple question. Why do we love Godzilla? First, and most obviously, I think, Godzilla movies are just good entertainment. The vast majority of the films are not great cinematic treasures, but who cannot respond to the spectacle of a giant radioactive lizard breathing radioactive fire and crushing a city under its feet? Who cannot take some primal pleasure at the exuberance of an actor in a rubber suit obliterating a tiny model Tokyo? And it is hard not to laugh at the bad dubbing, terrible acting, and silly storylines, not to mention the crazy-looking monsters in some of the films. Second, like all stories of monsters, Godzilla helps us deal with our greatest fears and deepest anxieties. Monsters help us make the fears that torment us more concrete and thus more manageable. Seeing a giant creature on a movie screen, or reading about Dracula in a novel, or hearing about dragons in a medieval tale allow us to have the intense experience of imagining some of our most profound terrors, but also the reassuring and liberating experience of imagining those monsters being controlled and ultimately defeated. Monsters like Godzilla allow us to give a name and a face and a form to fears that are often abstract or invisible, like radiation back in the 50s, and more recently, novel coronaviruses and climate change. And to domesticate, control, and imaginatively overcome, and therefore disempower those things that threaten us the most. Thus, Godzilla does not only entertain us, But Godzilla also helps us to cope with a big, scary world beyond our control. Third, I feel we're drawn to Godzilla and keep watching the movies year after year, decade after decade, because the films stimulate our creativity and stir our imaginations. The franchise as a whole is well known for being consistently and sometimes frustratingly open-ended and mysterious, provoking questions from viewers but providing little in the way of firm answers. Thus, fans of the series have long discussed and debated many fundamental issues about Godzilla. Why does Godzilla keep attacking Tokyo? If he's ticked off at America irradiating him, why doesn't he walk to Hollywood? Okay. What sex is Godzilla? I usually call him a he, but I can't sex a lizard. You know, down there he looks like a Ken doll. There's nothing going on. Okay? What is he? No clear answers are given in any of the movies themselves. And indeed, the refusal to provide answers to questions like these is a conscious strategy on the part of the filmmakers at Toho. As the studio's president, a guy named Matsuoka Hiroyasu, has remarked, and I quote, "We want to make Godzilla as mysterious as possible. That way, we can give audiences room to imagine what Godzilla is doing and why Godzilla is doing it. So mysteriousness might be what we believe is the secret to the popularity of Godzilla." So unlike so many Hollywood movies that give you simple, happy endings, tie up all the loose strings in the plot, and leave you really with no questions, Godzilla movies tease you, they engage you, and they encourage you to set your creativity free. Fourth, unlikely as it may seem, whether you see Godzilla as a giant cinematic monster or a man in a rubber costume, Godzilla has an uncanny ability to speak to many people individually, even though, of course, he does not say a word in any of his movies. As I found in many years of talking about Japanese monster movies to public audiences at colleges and universities, fan conventions, film festivals, museums, and libraries, people across demographic lines, race, sex, nationality, age, feel a kind of personal connection to Godzilla that is remarkable and wonderful and also, frankly, a little bit strange. So let me tell you two quick stories. So a number of years ago, I was giving a talk very much like this one at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington. We were in a big old auditorium, and at the end, a young man stood up at the back and he raised his hand, and I called on him to ask a question, and he said, "Would you like to see my tattoos?" Well, how do you answer that question? Hell yeah, let's see the tattoos. So he pulls off his t-shirt, and there is Godzilla. Every inch of his chest and his back is covered with a monster curling around the shoulder onto the back. I said, "That is so cool and must have been so very painful for you." He says, "Oh, I'm not done," and starts undoing his pants. I'm like, enough, time out, we're done here. So here's the second story, which is a little bit different. So a couple years ago, we did a film festival of Godzilla films in Kansas City. And after I showed that original film, the 1954 original, a middle-aged woman held up her hand. And I said, "Yes, please." She said, "I got to tell you a story. A few years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. The cancer wasn't really so rough, but the radiation therapy I thought was going to kill me. I really wondered if I was going to survive. So what I did was, every day after I got my therapy, I put on a Godzilla movie and I watched it. And I thought to myself, if Godzilla can be irradiated by an H-bomb and still endure to defend his nation, I can make it through this radiation therapy to be there for my family." Like, wow, okay? In the one case, here's somebody who cares enough about Godzilla to really deface his body for the rest of his life, and another person who really feels that Godzilla spoke to her and saved her from an extraordinarily difficult situation. That's incredible, you know, to me. So there's some magic in Godzilla as well. In the end, though, I feel that what makes Godzilla so compelling for so many and so significant, not just for Japanese culture or American culture, but for global culture, goes somehow beyond the movie monster's longevity, ubiquity, topical relevance, and sentimental appeal. Godzilla distracts us and makes us laugh, as entertainment is meant to do. Godzilla challenges us to think and imagine and feel in ways that pop culture so seldom does. And the Godzilla films shine with a profound and genuine optimism that we all need more of at a uniquely complex, unsettled, and anxiety-ridden time. In the Godzilla series, movie after movie, human society endures. Tokyo gets miraculously rebuilt, and the king of the monsters returns once again from the sea. This essential optimism, this faith in progress and in the resilience of humanity, was important in the 1950s when Godzilla helped Japan and the world recover from the nightmares of the atomic bombs, and remains powerful even today in the wake of the more recent tragedies to affect our world. On some level, Godzilla is just a man in a rubber suit, but I hope you'll agree with me that when all is said and done, the king of the monsters is truly so much more. And this is a church apparently in Tucson that was vandalized, but in such an appropriate way. Can you blame them for doing that? Thank you so much. I would be thrilled to take any questions or comments. Yeah, sure.
So the recent movies, we've seen Godzilla and King Kong. So King Kong is purely American, Godzilla, Japanese background. So do you think it's more of like a movement towards friendship between Japan and America?
Because you know what's interesting, right, is in the movies, certainly in the first one during the pandemic, they really work together, you know? And so it is a very positive, uplifting message from that film. And even in the most recent film, while they do fight, they really end up being on the same side, you know? And so I think the filmmakers are trying, whether they're successful or not, to promote this idea of world harmony. And that's a good thing. Yep. Yeah. Best Godzilla film is, if you're a sort of a purist like me, you love the original. If you're just going to watch one, especially if you're a younger generation and a black and white movie with subtitles drives you crazy, go watch Godzilla -1, the most recent film from Japan. It is a great movie. The special effects are really, really cool. And the story is really gripping, whether or not you know anything about Japan's history. If I, though, you know, let's be frank, I know we're a Baptist school, but if I had a couple beers and want to have fun with a Godzilla movie, the Smog Monster cannot be missed. That is one crazy movie. And don't try to understand it. There's no understanding it. Yes?
In Japanese history, in the background, ancient Japanese history, are there creatures or mythical creatures or whatever that this kind of springs out of?
What a great question that is. You know, Japan has a very rich imaginary of monsters in folklore and mythology. Japanese islands are crawling with legends of creatures. And one of those creatures that appears quite often is dragons. So Godzilla does have some resonance with Japanese dragons. And one of the things that's particularly interesting about dragons in the East Asian tradition, both China and Japan, is that dragons, unlike, you know, you think about the Western tradition, knights always have to kill the dragon, right? You see a dragon, you kill it, right? It's like me and a snake, you know? You don't ask questions. Just be safe, kill the thing, you know? So dragons in the Western tradition are evil, demonic creatures. In Asia, they're much more ambiguous. They can be good sometimes and evil at other times. And in many cases, it's how humans treat the monster that determines how they behave in return. So of course, if you're trying to stab a monster, they're going to fight back. But if you worship the monster and treat them well, then they become more peaceful. And so I think you can see that playing out in the Godzilla films in a way. And that helps us understand why Godzilla changes so much from film to film. Sometimes he's angry, sometimes he's heroic. And that's just goes with that sort of cultural baggage? What a fun question. Thank you. Yeah.
So you went to such prestigious institutions. So you were studying Godzilla as a I don't know. But
I did not.
I was wondering if these institutions could be very attached to tradition, and I was wondering if you ever encountered some resistance from advisors or anyone.
What a good question that is, too. So let me tell you, so I grew up a Godzilla fan, right? And you realize at some point in your life that, you know, the way to have an active social life is probably not to love giant monster movies. And so from my teenage years, this became sort of a hidden passion of mine. And you're right, when you go to prestigious institutions, they don't think kindly of popular culture in general, or something certainly with the lack of cultural cachet that Godzilla movies have. This is really a degraded cinematic form. So I kept it secret. But then, once I got my first teaching job and was teaching Japanese history, I said, what better way to involve students in Japanese history than by showing these films, which are like documents of Japan after World War II. At that time, so I started using, I was one of the first people in America to use Godzilla movies in my teaching in the mid-1990s. As I said, at that point, you couldn't get the Japanese original film, but I found a guy in Hong Kong who was selling bootleg VHS tapes of the original with homemade subtitles, which were terrible. Nonetheless, I showed it to my students. And you know, there's no student in the world who watches a Godzilla movie and says, I'm going to learn a lot about Japanese history from seeing this. So I call it the great sucker punch, right? Since nobody expects to learn something, when they do learn something, the light bulb goes off, you know? And so from that time on, I've used them in my teaching, and I think it's a great entree into understanding more about Japanese culture, you know? Questions you might not ask otherwise. And I've gotten a lot of pushback over the years from my colleagues and so forth. But, you know, in the end, when my tombstone is carved, they will put Professor Godzilla on it, I think, rather than all the boring other historical stuff I worked on over the years. Love that question. Thank you. Yeah.
So Godzilla was kind of used to first kind of highlight the effects of the bombing.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And then later, can't remember which Godzilla it was, and they started talking about like global warming.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Is there any Godzilla events to where you're like, we really needed like a kaiju to like really bring this up, and we never did?
Yeah, you know, I think there are lots of opportunities out there for Godzilla to take on a lot of issues. You know, I have always wanted a Godzilla movie, especially the recent movies, to deal with fake news. To somehow have a large group of people say, Godzilla doesn't actually exist, you know, and it's all made up, you know? And so then how do you deal with these conflicts we have in our minds, you know, about truth and science and so forth? You know, it might be too brainy for people to get into, but I think it'd be cool nonetheless. Yeah. And you know, goodness knows, there are enough issues in society. Back in the 70s, there was a Godzilla movie made about the school bullying problem in Japan. Who would have thought Godzilla, you know, would have any relevance to that? But for the audience at the time, who were largely, you know, 8-year-old boys, having Godzilla say, stand up for yourself, don't allow you, that was powerful, right? It's like watching Sesame Street or something, but with a giant monster, you know, giving you life lessons. So, yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any Godzilla tattoos, and if you do, can we see them?
Oh, what I love, that's the best question. I'm going to take that question away and remember it. I do not. And so, I hate, if that marks me as a far from serious fan, I apologize. My office, however, is filled with Godzilla figurines. And as my colleagues know, it's because my wife won't let me have them at home. She hates those things. And so my colleagues get to see them all the time. But you know, it's really fun. And one way I judge job candidates, and there's some people here who have been through that process, right, is when they come into my office, what do they say? So some people come in and see all the Godzilla toys and they're sort of afraid, and they say nothing. And I'm like, oh, disappointing. Then some people come in and go, so cool, tell me about Godzilla. And I'm like, wonderful. And then the ones I'm like, I'm going to hire you immediately are the ones that say, oh, I'm going to take a picture for my daughter, you know? And that's really, really great.
Okay, we'll take one more question if there's one more question.
It's Mahesh.
So you explained lots of aspects of our Godzilla figure, and you asked a nice question, so I'm going to build upon it. So what future do we have for the Godzilla figure to bring the peace to the world as a common enemy maybe, so that the whole world can be together, maybe something like that?
Yeah, I think we are at that kind of moment right now, because this is really the first time in history that both Japanese studios and Hollywood are making Godzilla movies at the same time. And they're subtly different. The Godzilla movies from Hollywood are very much action films. They're aimed at large audiences. Largely the money they make is in China at this point, you know? Whereas the ones from Japan are more intellectual, more topical, and so forth. So it hits a wide range of audiences. And this has the ability, I think, for Godzilla to move beyond being sort of a cult film for a small, very dedicated fandom to being something more broad. That has a bigger message. So I'd like to believe that would happen. On some level, I don't care. Just keep making Godzilla movies, and I will be happy. Because, you know, to me, this is my life, right? You know, it sort of scares me that I was born so close to when Godzilla was born. But his career and my life have traced each other, and so to have this moment where the King of the Monsters is never more popular than he ever has been before, that's special for me. Thank you.
Outstanding. So Dr. Tsutsui will be here. Anybody wants to come back up to talk with him, chat with him? You have some questions you were afraid to ask because they were too childish. There's an opportunity to come on up and do that. Help me thank Dr. Tsutsui for being here today.
Thank you, Dennis.